the way we think about teaching about ethics and creating scenarios and cases, we either create the ethical dilemma, which is something that is a time when it truly is often a right versus right or wrong versus wrong kind of challenge, which then can actually, they're interesting to think about from a philosophical perspective, but they can actually feel a little bit disabling because it's not as if you usually can come to a definitive conclusion about what the right thing to do is. So that's one thing we do, one path we tend to go down. And the other path we tend to go down is to share the cautionary tale. So we'll have cases about Enron and cases about WorldCom and cases about Volkswagen and Wells Fargo and Equifax and whatever. And so those are actually the examples of the bad actors. And that can be instructive in terms of doing a sort of postmortem about where did people go wrong. But again, the impact can often be rather disabling because it's not actually helping people feel like they have choices. And in a funny way, it's kind of reinforcing the idea that people do the bad things, do the wrong things. Even some of the really interesting behavioral economics and behavioral ethics research kind of unintentionally, I think, reinforces this because we talk about, everybody always lies, or we talk about all of these kinds of tendencies that we fall into. And it's not that they're not necessarily real or true, but they're also not necessarily the only option. And the trick, I think, for us is to figure out how to counteract that and how to create some sort of alternate path. And so what we try to do with GVV, with Giving Voice to Values, is give people scenarios which, as I mentioned, are post-decision-making scenarios where someone's already decided what they think is right. So first of all, you don't get stuck in that endless debate. You're actually talking about, okay, this person has decided it's appropriate to be truthful with the client here, or they've decided that this product is unsafe and so they're going to make changes to it before they release it or whatever it is. They've made the decision. Now, how do they communicate that in a way that it's actually going to be effective within their organization? What data do they need to gather? Who do they need to speak to first? Do they do this alone or do they need to create a kind of set of allies? Is it going to be an incremental process? All of those kinds of questions, which typically you never get to in an ethics class. In an ethics class, you just say, what's right or what's wrong, And so those questions that I just identified, they in and of themselves are not ethics discussions, and they're certainly not philosophy discussions. They are, in fact, practical, scripting, action-oriented decision-making, problem reframing. How do you use power and influence? How do you negotiate? So that's where some of that behavioral ethics research can be useful. So if, for example, we know about decision-making biases that people fall prey to, false consensus bias, groupthink, discounting the future, all of those kinds of biases that lead people to deceive or to make poor choices. If we know about those, we can name them, we can acknowledge them, and we can actually use them. So if we know that people assume that everybody is doing this, what we can do is try and create an alternate social referent group. So before we try and influence somebody, we try and build a set of allies so that it's not just one person coming to them. Or if we know that people tend to discount the future and only look at short-term costs and benefits, we can try and make some arguments that actually have some short-term implications for good or for ill for what we're trying to do. It doesn't mean we disregard the long term, because that's often a powerful part of our argument. But the thing is that we need to use that information rather than to feel like it's simply a constraint or a reason for despair,